idea of selling off Channel 4 and privatising it completely. It has been, I think, a very good channel, and I think it has done a lot of innovative things and continues to do so. And in developing its own content, that can only be a good thing as well, because it does show the importance of public service broadcasting. And I think we should reflect that the direction this bill is going in is one of proper regulation of the media, but is also recognising the value of public service broadcasting, the importance of it. And if we compare that to the history of the United States since the Second World War, which has systematically defunded public service broadcasting in the USA and ends up with news values essentially dominated by Fox News and nothing else. And so I think we should value the principle of public service broadcasting. And I'm also particularly pleased that Gaelic and Welsh language stations are not just protected but supported in this piece of legislation, because both of them have led to a big increase in both Gaelic and Welsh speaking and an enhancement and development of the culture of both Scotland and Wales. There is a need, I think, to also say that we criticise journalists, as many of us often do, but we also very much value the idea of a free press and a free media with good access to it. That is not always appears to be the case, and I think we should think a little bit more about multiple ownership of different media outlets, TV, newspapers, radio, and so on. But this bill is also about trying to keep up with the changing technology on the media landscape. And there was a time when radio was one thing, television was another, and social media had not even been invented, and newspapers were completely separate from all of them. Now, essentially, all are merged into one in some way or the other. You do a radio interview, basically it's televised. You do anything in a newspaper, it will probably appear on their website and possibly as a video as well. That's not a bad thing, it's often a very good thing, but it is the recognition that there is a sort of universality of it, and that many people get their information from online sources anyway. But I think we should also be slightly cautious. We're all talking here as people who are, I suppose, media obsessives. We read newspapers more than anybody else. We probably listen to current affairs more than anybody else in our society. We seem to forget that there's a significant proportion of our population don't watch very much television, have no access to smartphones, don't know how to use a computer, and are completely lost in a digital divide in which they're increasingly isolated and left behind. This bill doesn't pretend to give an answer to this. I'm not sure there is a very simple answer to it, but I just think we should recognise that there is a growing proportion of the population, not huge, but significant, who often lose out on all kinds of information as a result of that. I just want, if I may, Madam Speaker, to briefly address the question of news values, what I believe to be a high degree of bias in the way in which a lot of news is reported on our media. Essentially, when international reporting takes place on global affairs, for most broadcasts, if something happens in the USA, it's news. If something happens in Europe, it's news. If something happens in whatever war is being followed at that time, be it the horrors of Gaza or the horrors of Ukraine, that is news. If something happens in much of Africa, Latin America or South Asia, it is simply not reported at all. The huge conflict that's going on in the Congo receives almost zero coverage in any of our media, either written or broadcasting. And the problems of, say, indigenous communities in Ecuador receives no coverage either. So I do think we need to think a bit more about how we can encourage all of our media to have a more global view when they're doing global reporting. The BBC has cut back significantly on its global coverage because it can't afford to have journalists all around the world, and so it puts them in the most best-known places. It puts them in Brussels, it puts them in Washington, and so on. It's cut back on them in many other places. The only global channel that significantly reports on, or tries to report on, the whole of the world is actually Al Jazeera at the moment, which is funded entirely by the Qatar government and royal family. So I just think we need to suggest there needs to be diversity in broadcasting, but also diversity in the way in which the news is chosen. And that applies to many other issues as well, including the reporting of environmental affairs and the debates about global warming. Commercial media is obviously driven by the need to survive and to make money, and therefore there is no great incentive on them to do anything other than do entertainment, because that's what brings in the audience and that's what brings in the advertising. It doesn't necessarily fulfill the question of information and education of the population. Now, I realise Ofcom has a very difficult balancing act to do here, but I think we should just be very well aware that the majority of the population no longer look at the two alternatives that most in this chamber grew up with, which was BBC and ITV. They look at a whole plethora of different news outlets, and therefore are getting a very wide variety of news issues thrown at them. There were a number of colleagues who have raised the issues of local journalism and local papers, and again they also appear very heavily online. And I once worked in a local paper, and it was genuinely a local paper. It was printed on the same site where we wrote the stories and so on, and it was completely part of the community. It then became part of a bigger group, that became part of a bigger group, that became part of an even bigger group. And you look at local papers across the country, they're actually not local at all. They're owned by a media group in a distant place, and if you're lucky, there's one or two journalists in the town in question, or if any at all, and they live largely by press releases. My friend, the member for Ross, Skye and Lochaber, quite rightly commended the West Highland Free Press for its work. And I remember when the West Highland Free Press was set up, and it was set up because of the lack of local reporting and a very serious determination by those that set it up to ensure there was a genuinely independent paper that covered all of a huge part of Scotland, and was able to build community strengths and links with it. And I think the paper has been actually very successful in doing that. A long distance away in a completely different kind of community, the Camden New Journal group, which is the Camden New Journal, Islington Tribune and other groups, is again a wholly independent group set up by the journalists within it when the previous owners essentially walked away from the paper. And it is independent, it is local, it is cooperatively run, and it's very, very successful because it concentrates completely on the news and stories within the local community and tries to bring them forward. But having newspapers and radio stations that cover all languages is very important. We talked about Scotland and Wales, but there's also a huge plethora of communities in this country who want to hear stuff in their own language. I remember speaking in this very house, probably from this very spot, in the 1980s, trying to defend London Greek Radio, which was set up as an independent Greek-speaking radio station. It was raided 74 times by the post office and all its broadcasting equipment taken away. Goodness knows what happened to 74 items of broadcasting equipment. Eventually, they were given a license, and it's now a very successful Greek language radio station. And there are many other language radio stations all across the country. That's important. It's important for people growing up in bilingual communities to be able to listen to things in their own language, and for young people to feel that sense of belonging to the Greek, to the Turkish, Somali, or any other community, as well as being able to communicate obviously in English. And so that to me is the great value of local radio stations. The last point I want to make is about social media. Often when I go to meetings, I ask people how many of them ever buy a newspaper. If the audience has nobody in it over 50, no hand goes up at all. Younger people simply do not buy newspapers at all and have no relationship with them at all. They rely completely on social media for their news, for their information, and for their ideas. And we all access social media. We're all driven in social media by various algorithms. some of which are owned by people far and far away who have patented those algorithms, and they follow us, they follow our interests, and they decide what news we ought to have. It is hardly free media when you're actually directed into the news that somebody wants you to hear. It's not simple. It's not simple regulating what algorithms do, but I just think we should be extremely well aware of it, and also aware that it's possible to set up, and unless I'm wrong about this bill, a radio station which is a purely online station where there is no regulation whatsoever other than the basis of libel law and things like that. Now that is an area that's going to grow, it's an area that's increasing, and some of the online radio stations have indeed got very large audiences indeed. Some of them are very good, some of them less so, but we have to be aware of that and the need in the longer term to come back for further regulation and control of the way in which algorithms behave and the way in which they can influence opinion, both politically, socially, commercially, and everything else in our lives. The last point I want to make is this: we should have a thought for a moment of the bravery of many journalists around the world. Those that have been killed in Gaza over the past few weeks, those that are in prison in Egypt, in Russia, and in a number of other countries, and those that risk everything in order to try and get news out. They need support and they need protection in every way that they can. And I would also like to just put on record, I think it's time to reflect quite seriously on the situation facing one of the world's best-known investigative journalists, that's Julian Assange, who has now spent almost 5 years in a maximum security prison for revealing uncomfortable truths about Iraq and other places. Journalism at its best tells us the truth. At its worst, it is a propaganda for somebody else, and somebody very, very powerful.
George Eustace.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.